Morning, Shane. Today we're going to talk about how to design the CISO role. This is a fun topic. I know that you're kind of the acting CISO at a lot of organizations, so I'm excited to get your input on this. But when we start, let's start off with a quick intro. You might introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. So Shane Peden, and director here at Risk 360 over our cyber risk division within the organization.
And as we joke at Risk 360, you're the CISO for what, 17 vCISO projects that we always joke. But for how many companies are you acting CISO for right now?
Well, I don't know that I'm acting CISO in a formal matter, but more or less, yeah, the guy that is in that role for, I don't know, I guess maybe 4 or 5 right now, and then it kind of shifts.
Awesome.
And, yeah.
Cool. So I'm Christian Hyatt. I'm managing director. I'm also the co-founder of Risk 360. I help oversee our security and compliance practice, and alongside Shane, helping a lot of companies build security programs and act in a CISO role. So cool. Just quick agenda today, Shane. So I thought, one of the big problems out there is organizations want to hire a CISO, but they don't really have a structure to do that. It's often, the first leadership position that they're thinking about hiring in the security space. And there's no, I think, good way to know what that role should look like. At least it hasn't been codified. There's not a book you can buy that will tell you how to do that. So we put a framework together to help do that. So, identifying a business problem and then prioritizing the CISO's role and then kind of creating a RACI diagram. We'll dive into that. But that's really where we're going today. We're going to talk about if you're thinking about hiring a CISO, or if you are a CISO and want to design your role because no one ever did that for you, then putting a framework together to do that. So first of all, let's talk about why this matters. Shane, in your mind, like, why is it important that we design a CISO role effectively? What are you seeing out there?
It's usually 2 things. On one front, it's an organization, typically the high growth startup or high growth technology firm, that has grown to a point that they really need to formalize information security in the organization. And so they need a CISO, or in our case, we kind of come in as a CISO team, or that vCISO solution that we sell. But then there's also the issue of a lot of turnover in the market and people coming and going a lot just for various reasons. And then also misalignment of expertise in the organization as well.
Yeah, I was doing some research for this. I know at one point, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the CISO used to turn over every 12 months, and then that kind of changed to 18 months. The research I'm seeing right now is saying that most CISOs are in the position between 18 and 26 months, which is a pretty short time, because it takes 18 months to build a security program at all, even to get traction. So if you have CISOs turning over that often, it's really hard to get a program off the ground. I know organizations that we're working for, that almost seems long. I know that we've seen CISOs come and go in 6 months or 12 months, basically last one audit cycle, and be a big burden on the organization. Also, the misalignment of expertise. I know we're helping some organizations hire a leadership role for that position, and it seems like everyone's looking for a unicorn. They want the CISO to be able to do everything, and basically take 3 or 4 full-time employees to fulfill that one role. So the CISO's coming in, they have one idea about what this should look like. The executive team has another idea, and obviously that creates a lot of conflict. So hopefully we can help solve that. So talk a little bit about the framework that we've put together to help think about what a CISO role should look like, and then we'll dive into it. We think about it in 3 stages. So the first stage, which is up here on that we're looking at now, is identifying the business problem. So what business problem are you trying to solve by hiring a CISO? Are you trying to solve compliance issues? Do you have true security problems? Are you building out an application that you need to be really secure? What are your business problems? Once you've identified those business problems, then you can start designing the role, because there's probably 100 line items that a security professional could be an expert at. You have to define, the 5 or 10 that really matter to you, and design the role and be able to communicate that to a candidate and to the organization. And then once you've designed the role, we recommend creating a RACI diagram, because ultimately a security program isn't ran by an individual or a team. It's going to be an overlay across all of the teams. So you're going to need to bring individuals from other aspects of the organization in to get them to own things, in addition to the CISO or the security organization. And those are really the 3 steps. And once you've done that, you'll have a really solid role design. You'll be able to communicate that to all the different stakeholders and then hold people accountable for it. So we're going to walk through those 3 steps now. So the first step, as I mentioned, is really just defining the business problem when it comes to information security. Shane, from your perspective, like what are some of the most common business problems that people typically want to solve when it comes to security?
It is almost virtually always the need of compliance or regulation, or customers driving it, which I guess you could say is also compliance. So you'll have a need to get a SOC 2 report, an ISO cert, PCI certification, HIPAA compliance, something like that. And then from there, once you get that individual in place or that team in place to solve that problem, a lot of other problems or needs start to come to light as you start building out the program to handle the compliance initiative.
Yeah, I think that's especially true for organizations that are like really have no security program to speak of, and they're dipping their toe in security. It's probably a customer requirement or regulatory requirement, just like you said, Shane. It's like, I can't close this deal, I can't get revenue unless we have a security program or a SOC 2 report or an ISO certification. And ultimately, they need a leader at the helm to get through that process. That's probably, especially based on our clients being kind of high growth tech companies, that's where they're coming from. And I think the other profile is there's like a secure or a true security risk. They either have a lot of customer data, maybe it's the government or some other similar thing, or they're building a product. You do have some product companies that sell security products, and in that case, they have a true engineering issue. They want to solve that security problem. They need someone with an engineering background. To me, those are the 2 most common. You have some others, but I think those are the 2 things. So what we say is, hey, make a top 5 or a top 10 list, and then come up with those, categorize them. And if you're looking at the screen, you can kind of see that. So we said, hey, our biggest problems are compliance, governance, app security. Come up with your top 10 list, categorize them based on compliance, governance, AppSec, or whatever, and then rank them. And then take your top 2 or 3 and then design your role around that. And that's the best you can hope for when it comes to a CISO, I think. So once you define your business problem, then we get into the universe of really trying to design the roles and responsibilities. And we have an example here. So I kind of think that roles and responsibilities when it comes to CISO fall into roughly 5 categories. You could probably argue a lot more. I think it's governance. So like that, a true leader. Are you looking for a true executive at the helm? Someone who can report to the board, do budgets, knows how to navigate the politics of an organization. That's kind of that governance and leadership bucket. Do you need a regulatory and compliance SME? That's the second bucket. Or do you need a true engineer or someone who's focused on application security? That's the third bucket. Network and perimeter. So that's a different type of security. Are you worried about incident response, network monitoring, things like that? It's the fourth bucket. And then the other one is information technology. Are you really looking for someone who knows how to do asset management, email security, endpoints, etc.? And in my mind, you can only have probably governance as table stakes. You need someone who's a leader because it's the CISO, right? And then you can have one other. It's not really feasible to have someone who's a compliance expert and also knows everything about information technology, whereas a compliance expert knows everything about AppSec. How are you seeing this, Shane?
Yeah, I noticed this is usually driven by the market that the organization is competing in, and then also the temperaments of leadership. Because in companies that are operating in maybe less regulated environments or markets, or maybe it's even it's not that they're less regulated, they're just less regulated on the front of information security or privacy. Mm-hmm. They usually tend to push more towards that IT ops focused. The example that comes top of mind to me are organizations saying construction management. That's a good one because it's a heavily, a lot of technology in play, a lot of very technical parts, a lot of IT to make what they do happen. but there's not really a lot of information security being pushed from a regulatory standpoint, because most of what they have that is sensitive is probably more geared towards SCADA stuff, like industrial systems, maybe IP, intellectual property, and proprietary stuff. And so you just don't see executives in the company usually thinking like, oh, well, I need to be heavy on, information, like governance in terms of like regulatory and compliance. They're more like, I just need to harden my perimeter or secure my systems so that my industrial control system doesn't get hacked. But then on the other front, say healthcare IT, those guys are spread focus everywhere. They care a lot about governance. They care a lot about regulation. If they're developing an app, they're across the board. Those are the guys that are usually looking for the unicorn CISO. They're like, we want you to understand the SDLC and then know HIPAA in depth, something like that.
Yep.
And then there's shades in between. Yeah.
And that's kind of the trap that a lot of organizations fall into as well, is they want to have a true CISO, but they want that individual to know everything. Like you said, they need to know AppSec, they need to know security and compliance, they need to be able to run the IT organization, and that's just not realistic. Ultimately, they're probably going to need a team, or security is going to be a shared responsibility. But if you really want to hire CISO and you want that person to have staying power, to be with the organization longer than 18 months, you're going to have to define that role and limit that role to something reasonable, and then deal with the fact that everything else that person's not an expert in is going to have to be hired in or shared amongst the team. And for me, if I'm hiring and interviewing a CISO, the ability to share that with them is a huge value prop. I mean, you're going to be able to get top talent because you'll say, look, this is the role I need. Do your skill sets align to that? And by the way, we recognize there's a whole universe of stuff that we still need, but we're going to hire for that, or we're going to have a shared responsibility with some of the other people in our organization. And I'll set you up for a lot of success. And that kind of brings us to the RACI diagram. So presumably you've identified your business problems, you've designed a role to really meet those business problems and identified some gaps there. Now you got to design your RACI diagram. And if you're not familiar with the RACI diagram, that's when you say who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. And so what we did is we took our 5 categories: governance, compliance, network security, app security, information technology, and said, hey, based on a RACI diagram, who's responsible for what? In our example, we said our CISOs got to be responsible for governance and leadership. They're the leader at the helm. And then for most of our clients, they're probably going to be responsible for compliance. And then network security is going to be like a network engineer. App security is going to be typically a software engineer. And then IT is going to be like an IT analyst at most organizations. So Shane, how are you seeing this functionally divided? Like, we work with a lot of high growth tech companies. Can you maybe give us 2 examples, like the high growth tech versus the manufacturing firm? Like, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so in clients that are, well, I'll start with the high growth tech. In the high growth tech, usually governance and compliance will fall more into the arena of general counsel a lot of times, in partnership with a CISO or somebody that is really familiar with that, especially legal matters. I'll use the healthcare IT again. It's great to have a CISO that knows HIPAA really well, but it's even better to have a lawyer that's versed in actually understanding how law works and case law and how, HHS, does stuff, or OCR investigates, et cetera. And then usually we like to spread accountability across functional areas of the business instead of putting it all on one person. And so that's where the accountability will actually come down to the CISO to implement the program, is how I usually think about it. And then the consulted will usually fall to strong leadership in the company that are really also champions. So at a few of our clients, this is oftentimes the CTO and the COO, the chief operator, or a VP of ops. So people that are playmakers and make things happen. And usually it's the technology head and the ops head. And then informed is usually a mix of board of directors or the IRC as a whole, maybe even the CEO, the founder himself, if he's heavily vested in this. Mm-hmm. And then usually you push down the network and the app security and the information technology. You push those down to subject matter experts on the accountability side. who really know what they're doing. And instead of saying you're now worried about security, you say, no, we're worried about integration of security into what you do every day. Now on the, say that construction management side, it gets a little bit different. It's usually more, we don't even know necessarily what governance and compliance stuff are a huge concern yet. And usually you might be concerned with some big stuff like maybe it's like FedRAMP or cousins of FedRAMP, regulations like that, because they want to do government contracts. And usually that becomes very hard to counterbalance with all of the technology stuff, because maybe they have a CISO that is heavily tech focused and doesn't live in that regulatory world. That becomes a little bit harder to solve for, because maybe they've never dealt with having to get audited or really build policies and procedures that speak to government entities or requirements. And maybe they just don't have that other type of experience that lends itself to dealing with regulators.
Yep.
Because they're a lot more focused on doing and getting solutioning problems than having to deal with, auditors and regulators and certifiers.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about like work structure in the next webcast. But I mean, I think one thing to recognize as an organization is that this security universe takes a village. I mean, if you're looking at this RACI diagram, you're going to have a security team. So your CISO, your analyst, you're going to have compliance professionals, so people who do GRC or your general counsel, like you said. You're going to have people who run technology, so your CTO, your engineering team, your product teams. You're going to have hopefully some committee that's bringing all of these people to the table so they can discuss issues of security. You're going to have your IT person, the person who provisions laptops and your network and make sure email is running. All of those people play a role, and those are typically separate people. That's not all one individual, because you'll see this trap where like your director of IT also becomes your security person, or some IT analyst takes on additional duties to do security stuff. And that's pretty common, especially early in the journey. But as your organization matures and grows and security and compliance and regulatory issues become more complicated, those will become separate roles, and you'll have to define those for each individual, and also have a place for those folks to collaborate and sit at the same table and talk about issues, which we'll talk about next time in our Information Risk Council. But anyway, just an important point, because trying to hire that unicorn is just not an effective way to build a security program. Anything else you want to add here, Shane, as far as RACI diagram?
No, I think you nailed it. Yeah.
So now I thought it would be helpful, because to me, there's like 3 or 4 common CISO profiles when it comes to looking for talent out in the marketplace. So I thought we could run through those and just talk about, what does that profile look like? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And then what kind of support do they need to really be effective? So the 3 or 4 that we identified were, there's the CISO profile that's really the security subject matter expert. There's the CISO profile that's really the compliance expert. There's the CISO profile that's the non-traditional CISO that was an executive somewhere else, maybe a COO that fell into the CISO position. And then an honorable mention that we can touch on is really the IT person that is doing additional duties around security. That's maybe not CISO in title, but really, the only security person you have.
Yeah. I was going to chime in as well. I feel like the CISO role is a little bit different than executive roles, because I don't know. Tell me if you disagree, Christian, but it feels like it's a newer role. Like it's really only been a focus in the market over the last 10, maybe 20 years in a lot of organizations. And so we've noticed there's a lot of people being put in this CISO role who may not be a true executive like what we're used to. We notice a lot more CISOs are only executives in title and are a lot more doers than other executives, with exception of maybe high growth, super new startups where, say, the CTO is also your technical co-founder who authored the platform. Like they were the original architect, and so they are very intertwined with the technology. So in those cases, every executive is a doer. In those kind of companies, those entrepreneurial companies. But I've even seen in large organizations where you've taken these profiles that you've outlined and you're putting people that are used to being doers, maybe directors or people that really get their hands dirty with stuff and pushing them up into these executive roles. So a lot of time this CISO is kind of not used to being somebody that's much more of a delegator or a strategist.
Yeah.
And they're a lot more used to getting their hands dirty. So it creates a different kind of beast.
Yep. When we talk
Yeah.
about that up here too, it's like the CISO often doesn't know how to report to the board, or doesn't know how to hire or train new employees and develop them, doesn't know how to delegate, doesn't know how to put together a budget and get that approved. So those are really common gaps when it comes to a CISO, for the exact reason that you just mentioned, Shane, is they're often a doer that just got kind of promoted and is a chief in title, but not functionally respected that way in the organization. And most organizations are going to have to figure that out. Is this a true executive position? Or is it really like a director position, but you're calling them the chief? And I think that's going to be up to the organization's personality, but something they're going to have to figure out, because you can't hold that person to the expectations of an executive, but give them none of the authority or respect that that position might deserve. And maybe because it's such a new role, the marketplace is still figuring that out, I think.
Yeah. I think the CISO also needs to get comfortable with thinking more politically or tactfully or strategically. I don't know what the right word is here, but I know personally, I've had to learn this lesson the hard way in organizations where we come and fill this role. Even though I do my best to be that unicorn, and I intentionally train to know all of those different subject matter areas that you talked about. Like, I really try to have not just an inch deep knowledge, but maybe a foot deep. Like, really, really understand how everyone works and have a few areas where I'm really strong in. I can't just be a doer. Like, I've got to learn at a certain point to delegate and also to communicate with executives and the board, and not get so drugged down in the weeds that I feel like I've actually got to understand, like, say, how the source code works at a code level, or how the app is really, really working, right? Like these deep app security stuff, beyond just it being a hobby and liking it. It's not my role to know it. At that level, I need to find the experts to delegate these things to and to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why the CFO is not typically sending invoices. There's like an AP
Exactly.
analyst and stuff. You got to be up, you got to be strategic, and ultimately security's got to be something the organization's willing to invest in, so the CISO can have that kind of authority. Those are great points. That's a good conversation. So just kind of moving back to like CISO roles, because I think, or I guess profiles, because that might be helpful to individuals. So the first one we identified was kind of that traditional security CISO. And to me, if you're looking for background, if you say, I need a true security expert at the helm because I have deep engineering problems and I want someone who understands that, that CISO typically has, some product background. They're typically doers. They were probably engineers in a prior life, and they rose through the ranks and, became an executive. That person typically thrives in engineering-minded organizations. So some organizations are kind of governance, they're kind of big picture oriented. Some organizations are just like, everyone's an engineer, it seems like. Shane, we've been part of these organizations, and those CISOs really thrive there because they have empathy towards those kind of folks. They understand product really well. They understand product security. They understand the burden of security when it comes to trying to move fast and build a product. So they often thrive in those environments because they can empathize strongly with them. However, their weakness is the engineering-minded CISO often hasn't reported to the board. They haven't dealt with a lot of regulatory and compliance. Maybe they don't understand the bureaucracy, or as a personality, don't like the bureaucracy that comes with being audited all the time and things like that. So the support I would recommend for a security-minded CISO is often to pair them with some strong GRC managers. So let them be at the helm, but maybe give them some folks who are really good at being audited and managing kind of regulatory and compliance programs. And that pairing is usually pretty successful. Shane, anything you want to add on the kind of the security CISO?
No, I mean, if you have general counsel or legal, which usually companies that are all engineers, they haven't got to a point where they have that in-house, but usually legal, if you're this type of security leader in the organization, you ought to really get to know your general counsel and see if they can help you to understand the other side of the world, the the regulatory side and the contract side, you know, because they can be your best advocate if you guys can come meet in the middle, help them understand the technology, help them understand your point of view, while simultaneously they can help you understand, well, this is why this is not desirable from a market standpoint or from a legal standpoint, you know, whatever it be. Yeah.
And if you have a security CISO, I can go ahead and tell you the things that are going to frustrate them is incompetent auditors or just auditors who aren't technically minded. That's a huge burden. Security questionnaires, that, you know, if your client send you a ton of questionnaires, you're going to sit in on calls and answer questions, audit type questions. Like, that's probably not where this person's going to thrive. Like, they might have the most secure product in the world, but they're really going to hate that bureaucracy.
It's an empathy issue, because I don't know, I don't want to generalize, but in my experience, these type of people in these roles may see that stuff as non-value add or wastes of time, when the reality is this security questionnaire, you may say, is ludicrous. It accomplishes little. I could just lie on it. This doesn't prove anything. It doesn't really demonstrate how secure or not secure my program is. But then you say, yeah, but I'm help closing a deal and further the business. You know, I'm helping enable sales. I'm helping give the client, you know, or the prospect assurance in the business so that they feel comfortable doing business with us. You know, so it's all about empathy and just seeing both sides of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the second profile is kind of the compliance oriented CISO. And that person is like probably got a public accounting background. They might have been an auditor at a prior life. They probably have a lot of governance and risk experience. The good thing about this kind of CISO is there, you know, if you have a ton of audits, if you're getting ISO, SOC 2, HIPAA kind of audits and compliance, they're probably going to be okay with that. If there's new regulations that enter the marketplace, they're probably going to be comfortable interpreting those and integrating it into the security program. They might even be exposed to the board, because at that level, you know, governance folks are kind of oriented towards the board. So that's all great. The downside is they're probably not a technical expert. They're probably not going to understand engineering at a fine level. They're going to have probably not a lot of experience choosing products and implementing products. And they're probably not going to empathize as much with the doers, the folks who are engineering the product or are securing the network functionally. So I would say they're great at navigating the politics, the bureaucracy, understanding regulatory and compliance issues, maybe lacking the deep technical knowledge. So again, that's where you want to think about what kind of support you want to give that person. So if I have a really strong governance and regulatory type CISO, maybe I want to pair them with some hands-on folks who really understand how to configure a firewall or really understand the engineering process, and that yin and yang will kind of, you know, make a better I guess balance between the positions. Shane?
Yeah, this is the role that we probably most often get, I guess we kind of move into in organizations when we come in, because usually it's a compliance and regulatory stuff that our clients don't have, and they really just want to fix it. You know, they just want to enable the business to do what it needs to do to grow. And this is directly in line with revenue, so it's super important. But completely does not make sense to build this all the time until you have to have it. It's a chicken and egg situation. My biggest pet peeve, though, is compliance-minded people that insist on compliance for the sake of compliance. I think the best thing you can do to number one, win a lot of fans within the business, get champions that will champion security and compliance initiatives, is to learn to empathize again, but also find ways to make compliance make sense. Like, take that compliance requirement, and instead of saying, oh, well, we just need to do this because PCI says we need to do it, go, well, wait a minute, what's the spirit of this control or this requirement? What do we already do? And how do we implement something that makes sense and makes the business better and doesn't overly burden engineering or technology or whoever while meeting the compliance requirement? And so it becomes a lot more of an art instead of being very scientific or empirical or maybe I don't have the word Christian, like maybe just heavy-handed. Like, I just see compliance as black and white. You're either doing it or you're not doing it. and being flexible and saying, no, let's figure out a way to make compliance work for us, make it better for us.
Yeah, if I'm interviewing a CISO, like the red flags I'm looking for is someone who is a complete yes man or woman, like compliance, check the box. We'll just kind of do it because the framework says to do it. Not a lot of art, as you mentioned. If I'm picking up on that, a lot of compliance for compliance sake, I'm not too comfortable, because the compliance CISO isn't just a check the box person. That's the person who understands how to navigate these multiple compliance and regulatory requirements in a way that will make sense for the business. Because there's an infinite number of ways that you can meet these compliance frameworks in line with the technology stack, with the culture of the organization. And hopefully that's what a really strong CISO has mastered. They know how to do that. They know how to do something that makes sense, that doesn't treat this like a check the box.
Yeah, I think the best thing that this type of CISO, if you're of this mindset, the best thing you can do is think in risk instead of compliance. Just learn to be risk minded. And also a very valuable lesson I learned, I'll use PCI as an example because it's very prescriptive. You read PCI and it reads almost like the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. Here's your requirements, do them. But what I've learned is that I can actually negotiate with auditors, and we can have compensating controls. And even though it does try to be very prescriptive and straightforward, PCI actually does allow you to work within it to meet the objective. You can, figure out different ways of doing stuff if you have an evolving technology stack that doesn't really line up to those requirements. And you need, as the compliance-focused CISO, find partners that are willing to bend with you. Don't hire audit firms or certifiers that are so rigid that they just see black and white themselves. That's part of being a good CISO, though, in this role.
Absolutely. Cool. So the next one we'll talk about here is really the non-CISO CISO. So someone that was probably a really successful executive. They're kind of a jack of all trades, someone that you can put in any position and they're going to be successful. Typically, we've seen this be the COO or a CTO or something like that took over the CISO role because it was a gap and they needed an executive at the helm. Some of their strengths is they're usually playmakers. They'll get stuff done. Like, they're just flexible. It doesn't matter what you tell them to do. They're going to get it done pretty well. They're probably attached to the business problem. They get business. They get why this is important. But they probably lack any of the technical skills to do the job. They probably don't know either security nor compliance nor regulatory issues at all. But hopefully they know how to go find those problems and get them solved. So how you're going to need to support that person is probably bring in third parties often that are subject matter experts, or either have a really strong management team or analyst team that do have those subject matter expertise to be able to give them the support around how to navigate the different regulatory, compliance, and security issues. I also say give them challenge them to have a really solid set of KPIs to measure the security program, so they can play that quarterback role. People can report the KPIs up to them and give you guys some confidence that ultimately, even though they're not a technical expert, they're managing the program effectively. Shane, I know we've seen many of these types of people in this role.
I think that this role this type of executive can be highly effective. We've seen them be super effective. Maybe some of the best CISOs we've ever seen are this type of CISO, where they're just an executive and they just get stuff done. The big thing that I've seen get this type of executive hamstrung is when they're actually two different executives at once. So you're a CTO and you're in charge of CISO. You have an inherent conflict of interest in your role.
Yep.
So as an organization, I guess it's on the org to say, no, we truly want to give the CISO independence to do what they think's best from their purview, and then let them go run with it. And give them the freedom and the comfort to go challenge the CTO or the COO or the CFO when they push back and they go, no, we don't want to spend this money on this, or we don't want to implement these controls because it's going to be a major inconvenience, or it's going to slow down the R&D, whatever it is, or we don't want to spend this much money on compliance. If they feel comfortable really, really challenging that, if they feel they need to.
Yeah, and just I think an important point here is the non-CISO CISO isn't an executive with two roles. It isn't a COO/CISO or a CTO/CISO. It's an executive that was moved over to exclusively own that position. And I'll say one of the things I like about working with these types of executives, especially the effective ones, is how humble they are. You know, the executive they realize they don't know anything about the role or anything about security or compliance. So they're the most willing to ask, like early. They're just like, what's the best practices here? How do I go about doing this? Who knows about this that I can bring in? And they do a really good job developing their team, giving their team opportunities to kind of rise to the occasion, asking great questions. And if you can bring an extremely successful and respected executive into that position, and they're humble about it, then they'll knock it out of the park. And I know we've seen that a bunch where they're just, not afraid to ask. They're humble. They're bringing you in on conversations. They're being transparent, and they're often the most successful. Where you might have a subject matter expert in the CISO role, but maybe they kind of have their own ideas about things or a little more ego attached to it, and that really hurts the role.
Yeah, these are my favorite people to work for, actually, because they really challenge us to tell our story and justify what we want to do. But it's not because like you said, that there's an ego in play. It's because no, it needs to make sense for me before you do it, and I need to understand it. And you need to bring it to a level where I understand it. And these people are usually very accomplished. So if we can't make it make sense to them, it probably doesn't make sense. And
they're good at. They have a lot of empathy with the leadership. Like, they understand what business case needs to be made and how to present that to, say, a CEO or a CFO. I think there are a couple non-starters if you're considering hiring a non-traditional CISO. One thing I think is they actually have to be interested in the position. We've seen some folks who get offered it, like, so for example, a general counsel or a COO that get offered the CISO position, and they don't want anything to do with it. They're not interested in security. It's intimidating. It's just not at all what they want to do, but they still get forced into the position, and they leave immediately. Like 6 months in, they're gone. So if that's the situation, like, that's not going to work. They have to be enthusiastic about the position. The second thing is probably well respected, especially if it's an internal hire. If you have a COO that's failing as a COO, so you're going to move them to the CISO position, that's not going to work out too, because they just don't have the respect of the organization and the executives to make things happen. And then the third thing is just being humble. If you have someone in the position that's got a lot of ego and is willing to let the organization fail because of their own ideas, that's probably going to be a non-starter. If that's the case, they probably weren't a successful executive anyway. But if somehow you find yourself hitting any one of those three, then I wouldn't recommend trying to get a non-executive or a non-CISO executive in that position. They really need to check those three boxes.
I think you need to give this person too comfort that if something goes wrong on their watch, they're not going to get fired over it, just because heads must roll every time something goes bad.
Yeah.
Because that's another reason people are not excited about becoming a CISO.
Yeah, a security breach happens. That was the last person's fault, and you're trying to fix it, but guess what? You're getting fired, and that's never fun. Yeah. So I think those are the three most common CISO profiles. There's one other that I'll touch on briefly. It's just often there's an IT person or a VP of IT or director of IT that takes on security responsibilities. And good on them for doing that. I mean, that's fantastic. We have some folks who somehow manage that I know, but ultimately, I don't think that's a long-term solution, especially if security is a big priority for your organization. And the reason that is not a long-term solution is those positions are naturally in conflict. Or there's really two reasons. One, they're both full-time jobs. There's not enough hours in the day to get them both done. And two, the positions are in conflict. And the reason we say that is because if you're a security person, but you're also in charge of implementing the technology, well, then you're ultimately assessing your own work. So you can't, you just can't be as independent about it as you would otherwise be able to do if you were separate roles. So that, for most organizations, isn't a good long-term fit. But out of necessity, some organizations will do it, and some people do it very effective because they're just effective individuals.
It's hard to go to your boss to admit that you missed something or misconfigured something, and something bad happened because of an error that you made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's just naturally in conflict.
Yeah.
So those are the roles. So we talked about, the framework, how to figure out a role. So identify your business problems, design the role around that, do a RACI diagram to see what individuals you're going to need to be able to bring into the security program in addition. Have that packaged up, ready to present to a CISO candidate, or if you're a CISO, package that up and present it up for approval to your board or to your executive team, so everybody's on the same page about the roles and responsibilities. Then we talked about a few of the common profiles. So you got your security CISO, compliance CISO, the non-CISO, CISO executive. So look for those. Those are all effective. As you're interviewing, you'll probably be able to put people in buckets and align that to the kind of role that you've designed. And hopefully this will give you guys the tools to ultimately design that role or to reform the existing role you have, or if you're a CISO, create your own role for the first time. The next thing I want to talk about is just what we're going to be talking about next, which I think is important, Shane, is really designing an organizational structure. So, you know, if you've designed your role, you're ready to make that hire, great. But now the question is, how do I overlay security as a program into my existing org structure? And we're going to talk about that in our next webcast and give a few examples of how, based on your organization maturity and size, you might want to reshape that work structure. And we'll do that in a couple weeks. So Shane, thanks for your time, man. Thanks for sharing your expertise and your battle scars. If anybody wants to learn more or want to contact one of us, you can email Shane at shane.peden@risk360.com. You can email myself at christian.hyde@risk360.com. These webcasts are also available as podcasts. You can find them on any pretty much podcast app that you listen to, iTunes, Spotify, whatever. We also have accompanying blog posts and white papers on this exact topic. So if you go to our website and look up blogs and white papers, you can find that there. So thanks, Shane. Have a good one, man. I appreciate your time.
Yep. Catch you guys later. Thanks.